Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning.
John, it's good to see you here this morning.
Amen.
Glad that you're feeling up to getting out this morning. The world has a very good way of wearing down the heart. We talked about in Bible class this morning. The world does a very good job of hurting us. The world does a very good job of pushing us to harden ourselves. And yet we see time and time again that this is not the way that we are to be. This is not the way that we as Christians are to live. And I'm sure you've heard the expression before, the preachers preach lessons for themselves. This is one that hits close to home. This is one that I struggle with quite frequently. It's hardness of heart and anger, and difficulty in forgiveness. And so I want to turn and look first at Luke chapter 15. Now here, Jesus is accused by the Pharisees of something they don't like. And it's difficult to see the attitude of the Pharisees. It's not difficult to see their attitudes, but it's upsetting to see their attitudes. So Jesus is going to use these parables to teach them. Beginning in Luke chapter 15 and verse 1, it says, "Then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes complained, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.' So he spoke this parable to them, saying, 'What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. I say to you that likewise there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 just persons who need no repentance.'" So beginning here, the Pharisees were looking down on Jesus. They were looking down on him because of the fact that he was willing to eat with sinners. He was willing to be with people that weren't like them. They weren't righteous, so to speak, as the religious leaders were. And so you see the hardness of the Pharisees' heart. They were looking down on them and they were judging them. And rather than loving them, rather than showing them the mercy of God, they showed them judgment. And so one of the things that we often say is that the Pharisees had a really good pointer finger. It worked very well at pointing at others. And they never really turned it back around to themselves. It's something that we as Christians need to learn to do in order to soften our own hearts towards others, is to realize that we are just as guilty. We all struggle equally with sin. We might not have the same sins, we might not have the same temptations, but we all struggle equally with sin. We all need each other's help and God's help in making it through this life. As we turn to Mark chapter 3, we see an example of the hardness of their hearts, and that they could not even rejoice with a fellow brother of theirs who had been greatly blessed. And so we turn to Mark chapter 3 and begin in verse 1. And it says, "And he entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a withered hand. So they watched him closely, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him." And so seeing this here first, they saw this man who was crippled. They saw this man who had this issue with his hand. And they sat there and they watched him. Because they didn't want Jesus to heal him. Well, they did. And they wanted to accuse him of something if he did it. But they didn't want this man to be blessed. They wanted this man as a trap for Jesus. And in verse 3 it says, "And he said to the man who had the withered hand, Step forward. Then he said to them, Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they kept silent. And when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. I had a shoulder surgery when I was about 17. I had to have this shoulder all put back together. And having your right arm strapped to your chest for months, it was terrible. Missing that arm, not being allowed to do anything with it. It was difficult because you would approach a doorway and immediately start to reach out with this hand for the strap that was holding it to your chest to keep it back. And realize, no, I gotta use the other one. To be told you can't lift anything heavier with a can of soda when you were used to doing whatever you wanted as a teenager, that was difficult. And so you look at the life of this man having a withered hand, whatever that meant, and crippled hand, it would have been difficult. Think of the way that life is, the way that we design things. We design things for the average human that has 10 fingers, 2 hands, 2 arms, 2 legs that all function properly. Because it's a pretty safe assumption that most people are going to be able to utilize those things properly. And so life would be very difficult for this person. And yet here, rather than rejoicing with him, because he had been blessed to the fullness of his life to enjoy it freely now, they said, we have this great opportunity to accuse Jesus. And you think again to what we just studied last week with the resurrection of Lazarus. Almost immediately after, they said, we have to kill him. Because Lazarus was proof that Jesus was the Christ, because he alone could raise the dead. And rather than say, since this is such concrete evidence that this is the Christ, this is the one from God that we should follow after him, they said we should kill that man to get rid of the evidence. How hard does your heart have to be that that's your conclusion? Let's make him dead again so the evidence is gone. They could not rejoice with him. Jesus here perfectly understands the hearts of men, and he looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts. And so we look at these ideas here, and we kind of think of this as an extreme example. I don't think any of us have ever plotted to kill somebody with any seriousness behind it. Hopefully not. But the way that our hearts are can be greatly compared. I've said it many times before, we don't look at examples like this out of the Bible to beat people up. We look at examples of this from the Bible because it was included there for our learning. Because these things are relevant to us. Our hearts do become hard. We do ignore the blessings of others at times to be envious of them. That's just as equally an issue as what the Pharisees were facing. We ignore the hearts of others when our hearts are hard, when they're seeking forgiveness from us. That's just as equally bad. And so we turn to Matthew chapter 23, which was our reading recently. And again, Jesus is going to address the hearts of the Pharisees. Beginning there in verse 1, this is going to be quite a lengthy read, but in verse 1 of chapter 23, it says, Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at the feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplace, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But you do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is the greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, Whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? And so as he goes through these things, he's speaking again to the hardness of their hearts. They had many different desires for themselves, and they were going to get them for themselves. He says there that they wanted to be seen by men, so they were going to use their position as religious leaders to gain it. They were going to demand that the people address them as rabbi, a teacher deserving of high respect according to Jewish customs. Jesus says he alone was a teacher deserving of high respect. It says there that they were enlarging the borders of their garments so that they could fit more scriptures onto their garments, because if they had more scriptures on their garments, it made them holier in their minds. You know, all these different things that we look at here. And he says again in verse 14, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers." We just studied in 1 Timothy chapter 6 that we don't use godliness for our own gain. Paul wrote directly to Timothy there, we don't use godliness for our own gain, but godliness with great contentment is to our gain. And so their hearts were hard, and their hearts should not be imitated. And so as we look to the heart of Jesus, the heart that we are supposed to have, we see the example that he gives with the parables in Luke chapter 15. Beginning there, he gives that parable of the lost sheep. And he speaks to those that they didn't really realize they were lost, but they were found, and we rejoice with them. But how hard are our hearts that sometimes we feel that a person is not sincere in their repentance and their coming to God? How hard are our hearts that we reject people at times when we have no place to reject people? He continues with the parable of the lost coin in verse 8 of Luke chapter 15. He says, "Or what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, for I found the piece which I lost.' Likewise I say to you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." Now I read something interesting the other day about the floors in houses during this time, and it was completely speculation, but the houses would have been like a gravel type floor, a stone type floor. It would have been very easy for a coin to fall between the cracks of the stones that were on the floor. And you think about how difficult it would be to find a coin in a place like that, and for most of us, the coins that we have, they're pretty worthless. And so to drop a coin like that, you might just say, whatever, forget about it. Are our hearts that hard that we know that there's a world of people out there who are lost, and it might be difficult to find them and reach them, but to give up on them? Are we going to allow our hearts to become that hard? Jesus wasn't. He says there that, likewise I say to you, there is joy in the presence of angels of God over one sinner who repents. There is great joy in going through all that effort just to find one who was lost in the cracks. And there he finishes with the parable of the lost son, beginning in verse 11. "Then he said, a certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me.' So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father, but when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to be merry." And so as we look and see the rest of the story here, he begins to talk about this boy's brother. And he says in verse 24 or 25, "Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. He said to him, Your brother has come, and because he has received him safe and sound, your father has killed the fatted calf. But he was angry, would not go in, and therefore his father came out and pleaded with him. So he answered and said to his father, Lo, these many years I have been serving you. I never transgressed your commandment at any time. And yet you never gave me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as the son of yours came, who had devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. And he said to him, Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. This is one of the hardest ones, I believe, for us as Christians. We don't like to forgive each other. We all think of each other as equals. This man was looking at his brother. If you have siblings, you know it's very hard to forgive them because we look at them so close to ourselves. And when they go astray and they do something crazy in our minds, we don't know what it was that they were thinking. We don't know what it was that they were going through when they made those decisions. And yet it's so easy for us to sit back and to say, well, I didn't make that mistake, so they must be a terrible person. But that's not the place that our hearts should be. We look and we see the message that Jesus is speaking here, and he's speaking the forgiveness of God. And it's something that should fill our hearts with joy, because we benefited greatly from the forgiveness of God. Every single one of us here in this room could just as equally say, I deserve to be dead for the sins that I have. And yet Jesus died for those sins. And all of us are together here to celebrate the joy that we have because of that forgiveness, because of his willingness to go and to take that place for us. And so as we think of the way that the world makes us feel, it makes us angry. It makes our hearts hard. It makes us bitter towards people. We come across so many people out in the world and we get tired of it. And we don't want to talk to them anymore. We don't want to have to put up with them anymore. But that's not the way Jesus wanted us to be. Jesus had a soft and tender heart for every person that came to him, no matter their situation. So again, we look back to the beginning. It says, and all the tax collectors and sinners drew near to him. What would we be like in that situation? You think of the tax collectors during this time, the tax collectors benefited greatly from scamming people. That was how they made their money as tax collectors. They would go and collect the required amount of taxes that they were supposed to collect from people, and then they'd add on their own little extra on the top. And as long as the government got their money, they didn't care what their tax collectors were taking on top of it. And so it would be easy to resent them. You know that they're making their money by adding extra fees on top of your taxes to make their money. It would be very easy to be upset with them. And yet Jesus had a tender, loving heart to those who came to him as they drew near to him. You look at the Pharisees again, and they said, this man receives sinners and eats with them. And so he began to speak these parables. Because no matter how difficult it might be, if we have to search in the cracks of the stones on the floor to find them, if they're willing to listen, they're willing to obey, we have much cause to rejoice. God has much cause to rejoice. If we have to go out into the wilderness to search for them, God has much cause for rejoicing. And if we have to overcome our own hearts to forgive them, there is cause for much rejoicing. So we see some more examples of Jesus' heart, first in John chapter 8 and verse 1. Beginning there, it says, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Now early in the morning he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? This they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are these accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. Jesus said, Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And so as they brought this woman to Jesus, they were right in saying that she should be put to death. but so too should have the man that she was committing adultery with. They weren't interested in executing justice. They were interested in judgment. And so we think again of our own hearts, our own selves, as we interact with people. How much time do we spend judging people? How much time do we spend looking at them rather than looking at ourselves? Sure, these people had committed many things under the old law that put them worthy of death as well by this point. They had defrauded many people. They had lied about many people. They had borne false witness against many people. Those things were all worthy of their own punishment. And yet they brought this woman to Jesus to test him. And he says, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." This begins a principle for us as Christians today, to remind ourselves, we all are with sin. We have no room for judgment other than the words that Jesus spoke. And Jesus said when he came into this world, he did not come to judge anyone, but his words would judge them in the end when that time has come. And so all of us have one focus if our hearts are truly in the right place. And that is living according to the words that Jesus spoke, including this tender heart towards those who are in sin, this tender forgiving heart to those who may have even sinned against us. And as we go through this life, remembering we are just as equally guilty of sin. We understand because of Romans chapter 3 that the wages of sin are death, and all of us have sinned at some point. And so all of us could have been brought before Jesus and said, this person according to the law is worthy of death. But again, he forgave that. And so as we look at the heart that Jesus had, we are to remember that we are to imitate him in every way possible. We talked about it on Wednesday, Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 1, one of my favorite verses in the scriptures. Imitate God as dear children. When we were at the farmer's market last weekend, it was Halloween trick-or-treating for the vendors to give out candy. And we saw some of the little kids. It was real cold, so there wasn't a lot, but we saw some of the kids there in costumes. And I always use this example for that verse because I think of Halloween time and how excited kids get to dress up and act like their favorite person, act like their favorite superhero. They put on the costumes, they walk the way they walk, they talk the way they talk. They do it all because they love that person, they admire that person, they're overjoyed to be just like that person. And that's exactly how we are to look at Christ. We are to look at him with love and joy and admiration, and want to be that in the world as we live today as well. And so as we think of our purpose here in this life, what Solomon wrote, we are here to fear God and to keep his commandments, and that includes loving, forgiving, and teaching as we are here in this life. Avoiding that hardness of heart that the world creates. I was looking in our songbook to see if we had a song. We don't have it, so I'll have to print it out sometime. But we sing a song out at the camp called Break My Heart. And to me, it reminds me of the purpose of trials. Because sometimes we do get into a place where we just have to be smacked around a little bit to be reminded we're just as equally weak. We're just as equally guilty as all these people that we see out in the world today. And so the lyrics of the song are, break my heart, dear Lord, tear the barriers down. Show me in convincing tears the glory of your crown. And through the song is essentially a prayer, help me to deal with the hardened heart the world creates. And so as we go through this life and we continue to live encouragement to continue to fight that hardening heart, because the world is going to continue to try to do it. As we live, it's a process that we have to continue fighting against. We have to fight against the hardness of heart. So this morning, first of all, I ask you to pray for me. It's kind of hard as the preacher to respond to your own lesson. But I need prayers to deal with a hardened heart. And if this morning, if you are dealing with a hardened heart, or you are not yet a Christian and you have not yet received the joy that comes from being forgiven, why wait? There are so many great blessings within Christ. There are so many great things. And first of all, just to remember that our heart doesn't have to be hard anymore, because we have a Lord who will protect us from that. We have a Lord who will protect us from the world, that we don't have to harden ourselves to fight against it. So, if there's anything that we can help you with this morning, will you please come as we sing the invitation song.